Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Schwartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. For over 70 years, the Council has brought our community fresh, nonpartisan, and civil discourse on the critical issues affecting the world. And while the last year and a half has been challenging in so many ways, we are enthusiastic to continue to offer programming and content, access to ideas, and the world's leading thinkers, albeit virtually. Thank you for joining us today. And today we are exploring US policy towards Russia since Putin first rose to power over 20 years ago. It's no secret that the US-Russia relationship has been fraught with tension over the last 2 decades. We'll hear from our expert speaker today on whether the US foreign policy towards Russia has evolved and adapted, or whether it has largely followed consistent patterns during the multiple US presidential administrations of Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, that Putin has been in power at the same time. I'd like to offer a special welcome to some of the high school students, college students, and teachers who participate in our council's education programs throughout the year. We work with over 2,500 youth across 85 schools in this region, and we're the leading provider of foreign affairs education and international education throughout Philadelphia. These students, passionate about world affairs already, are perhaps the ones who will solve some of the world's most complex challenges ahead. And as another school year starts, full of complex challenges as well, we wish all of our students and teachers a successful and peaceful start. And thank you to the Mid-Atlantic Eurasia Business Council for serving as our promotional partner for today's webinar. Our session today will feature questions from you, our audience. After opening remarks from our guest speaker, we'll move right into audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform to submit questions at any point, and I'll facilitate those with our speaker today. As always, the first question will come from a local student before we turn to the general audience. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Mitchell Orenstein. Professor Orenstein's research focuses on the political economy of transition in Central and Eastern Europe, pension privatization worldwide, the role of ideas in economic policy reform, and Russia's hybrid war on the West. Among other works on political economy and foreign policy, he is the author of 3 prize-winning books. Professor Orenstein has also submitted a new manuscript for publication to Oxford University Press. It's called The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War. In it, he explores geopolitical competition between Russia and the West for influence in the lands between Russia and the European Union, and how the policies and politics of these countries provide a useful guide to the unexpected political dynamics of Western countries in the era of hybrid war. Orenstein teaches a course on communism at the University of Pennsylvania that analyzes the rise and fall of this alternative political economic system, its legacies and relations to social democracy. He teaches a course on Russia and Eastern Europe and international affairs that analyzes the geopolitical competition between the European Union and Russia over the countries in between. He also teaches managing globalization and anti-globalization at the Wharton School, which provides a sweeping introduction to international political economy from the last 150 years and in the institutions that manage this global economy. Today, Professor Orenstein will be talking to us about Putin's reign over the last 20 years and how various US administrations, from Clinton to Biden, have contended, whether successfully or not, with this fraught and complex international relationship. Welcome to you, Mitchell, and thanks for being with us today. I'll pass you the virtual microphone to make your opening remarks, and then we'll start taking questions from our audience. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That's a really kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here today with you at World Affairs Council. So thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Haley, for organizing this event. I want to share my screen, so that's the first thing I should do, is share my presentation with you. There's so much to say about this topic. I think Vladimir Putin is one of the most fascinating and talked about figures on the world in world affairs. the whole issue of US and Russia, of course, captured a lot of attention in regard to the 2016 electoral campaign in the United States and Russia's intervention in it, and also the 2020 campaign. There's one thing I would also point out that I get into in the book, The Lands in Between, about this will introduce you a little bit more to my background, which is heavily in the lands in between. I've been for many, many years a student of politics and economics of Central and Eastern Europe. These are countries who dealt with Russian influence much more directly and for a much longer period of time than the US has, right? And I know that this talk today is about the United States, of course, our own country. But my background is in studying Russian influence in Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Romania and Bulgaria and the Baltic states, and really dozens of European countries over the past 20 years. And that's really the content of the book that I've published on this topic. So, and then trying to apply some of those lessons to the US case. So just a pointer on that my perspective is not just a US perspective. I think a lot of people look at the US-Russia relationship is kind of like the biggest thing that's going on in the world, and like that's the only thing that's going on, which is understandable because it is a big deal for the United States, but the same sort of dynamics have been unfolding in 20 other countries. So we have lots of comparative experience to build on, and that's what I bring to the table, I think, with this talk. So with that, though, I want to just focus on a couple questions. I actually would like to speak very briefly, if possible. This is actually not my forte, but I've learned that that I can make my points kind of quick and early. And I really enjoy your questions, so I hope you will submit your questions in the chat, and that I will answer as many of them as possible, because I think that'll be really there's so much happening and so much on your minds. I'm sure that'll be a really dynamic way to get into this. So I want to focus my short remarks in less than 20 minutes, I hope, about 4 questions. So what are Putin's objectives and how have they changed? That I think is really the core thing, because in a lot of ways, we don't really know that much about Vladimir Putin, right? And he keeps it pretty close to the chest. I don't know how successfully even US intelligence agencies have penetrated his inner circle and are able to find out. And as a result, there's a lot of dispute, a lot of debate in expert communities about what in the world Putin really is aiming at. And there are various schools of thought. So I want to talk briefly about my perspective about that. And then secondly, I want to deal with the big issue, which is how have US presidents dealt with Putin? And that's a great question. I think that it was phrased in the introduction very well, that essentially there are 2 different ways of looking at this. On the one hand, you could say, well, each president has done things differently, which is for sure true, right? Because presidents all have different approaches to foreign policy. But at the same time, there are also big patterns that structure the US-Russia relationship. They're constant over time. And I'm going to argue more on the pattern side today, that discerning the broad patterns that are going on here, and talking a little bit about that, as well as some of the differences in style and approach. Thirdly, I think you can't talk about this without saying, has Putin intervened in US politics, and how does it matter? Because that's a question that's on the top of a lot of people's minds. People care about in the US context. And then also I want to address a little bit what are the ground rules and possibilities for US-Russia relations going forward, and what does that look like? What are the opportunities that exist? What are the problems, and how to approach that? So first, let me just say that my interpretation, there are 2, when I got into working on Russian foreign policy, and this is many years ago now, but my prior dissertation work and a lot of my work has been on political economy. And so I'm very familiar with the politics and economics of this part of the world. Foreign policy, I began working on when I was a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, DC for 5 years, and really got into foreign policy issues at that time, starting around 2007. And it became very quickly clear to me that there were 2 broad, basically, interpretations of Russia in the United States. One is a sort of hawkish interpretation, And that's the one that I share. And the second is a sort of dovish interpretation. And it's important to put that on the table because I know in the audience, there's a lot of people who hold views from different sorts of perspectives. And I want to immediately, on the one hand, articulate where I'm coming from, but also to sort of validate to some extent both of these perspectives, right? They're both perspectives because they both have some reasonable grain of truth in them. So my interpretation is a more hawkish one, and it emphasizes these points that Vladimir Putin's key objective, and I believe he's stated this very clearly in his speeches starting with Munich Security Conference in 2007, that he wishes to establish a multipolar world in which Russia is a key power. He wishes to diminish US leadership in the world and the US-led liberal world order. He has a clear intent of splitting the US from its European allies. And so a lot of Russia's activities are trying to sort of gain friends in Europe and sort of turn friends of the United States against the United States or vice versa. He wishes to replace the key institutions of the European security right now, which are the European Union and NATO. I can explain those in some depth maybe in the answers, but these are the cornerstones of a European security arrangement that's been in place in Europe since the Second World War, with institutions that more fully include Russia and its interests, and wishes to destabilize, of course, the United States politically. Now, just to say, that's my perspective. I want to say that there is a more dovish interpretation of Putin's actions, which I don't mostly agree with, but it does have some validity, which tends to point out that Putin is not solely in charge. So somebody from a dovish perspective might say, why are you talking so much about Putin? You know, he's not really necessarily in charge. There's actually multiple centers of power deciding on foreign policy in Russia, and they sometimes have different perspectives that go against one another. And so you can't say that any one particular action that the Russian state takes is necessarily because of Putin or it's necessarily coordinated. The second major point, I think, of the dovish perspective is that the United States is not reacting, the West is not reacting to Russian actions in the way that I'll spell out, but actually it's the opposite, that Russia tends to be responding to US dominance in the world. And it is naturally kind of in a situation where it has to, it's constrained by the dominant world power and in kind of a corner, and it's understandable that it sort of seeks various ways to kind of get out of that situation. So I just wanted to introduce you to both of those kind of perspectives because I know that they'll come up to some extent in the question and answer period. So US responses. So I'm going to talk about the responses that the US has had to a Russian campaign since 2007 to basically wage what I term in my book a hybrid war on the West. I'll also note that that term is very disputed. Some people don't love the term hybrid war. Some people prefer other types of terms like political warfare or various other things. But in essence, my argument in the book is that since at least 2007, Russia has waged basically some type of conflict against the West, which is in a way no holds barred, but in a way it's not primarily a military conflict, or it's not meant to be primarily a kinetic all-out war. Of course, in Ukraine, there is a war going on, but for the most part, what this conflict consists of is sub-warfare mechanisms, sub-warfare means. So some of these involve, for instance, cyber hacking. You may be aware that purportedly Russian hackers disabled a major gas pipeline in the United States that was ferrying gasoline into the southeastern states a couple months ago, causing huge lines in gas stations. So that kind of thing, well, you can't 100% attribute that to the Russian state because it was by hackers. Those hackers may have been based in Russia, but we don't know for 100% certainty if they're commanded by Putin or maybe they were just allowed or whatever. So the type of hybrid warfare techniques that I'm talking about in the book are a variety of things that are intended to be, I think, attacks on the West that don't rise to the level where the US would respond. Another example is, for instance, the intervention in US elections, right? So it's interesting that in the 2020 election, Kremlin said very clearly, oh, we absolutely are not intervening in the election, but there's tons of evidence that they were intervening in the election. And so when you have denials like that, for instance, when Russia invaded Crimea, they didn't say that those troops were Russian. In fact, there was a term, I don't know if you heard of it, called little green men, right? So there were these people who came into Crimea in uniforms, but they didn't have any patches on the uniforms that would distinguish who they were. And for several days, Putin said, no, our army is not in Crimea. We are not invading Crimea. But of course, it was the Russian army, right? So these are the types of techniques that that exist. And I should also mention a lot of this happens through spying, covert espionage sort of techniques. So there's been a campaign of killing Russian dissidents in the West. The Skripal case was the most notable one in the UK, of killing an ex-spy with a chemical weapon, which sort of seemed like overkill, but those things are meant to be kind of tests against the West, saying, yes, we can use a chemical weapon in your country, right? That's a kind of message from Skripal. It wasn't really that they were trying to only target this guy, but they were sending a strong message to the West that we have total impunity to do what we want in your territory, and we have a lot of capabilities that you wouldn't like us to use. Many other things we can go into. I don't want to spend the entire time talking about that. So I just want to say that the US broadly has vacillated typically in its responses. Initially, I believe the US did not really register that this type of warfare was going on. And from about 2008 until 2012, especially under Medvedev, when Medvedev was president of Russia, the West basically was slow to even recognize that something was happening. In general, in the West, we don't really want to have difficult relations with Russia. We would prefer to be have an alliance or at least accommodation with Russia. And so it was hard for our leaders to sort of say, well, that's not really happening anymore. We want to get back on that track. And so let's not take these provocations too seriously. Also, it has to be pointed out that in comparison to Putin and US leaders, presidents are pretty inexperienced in foreign policy. I wouldn't say they're quite as inexperienced as, say, our today's high school students, right? Who I know are, from past experience, you're very sophisticated. But it's a different sort of thing to be sophisticated in understanding foreign policy and just sophisticated in conducting foreign policy. And mistakes are often made. We're in the middle of one of these mistakes right now in Afghanistan, right? Where things, even if with the best intentions, with the hopes of trying to do something, they don't always work out the way they seem. And Putin is now, by definition, way more experienced. I mean, he's been in office, I don't know how many years, since 2000, really. So that's 20 some years. He's expected to be the longest serving Russian leader, surpassing Stalin. And so he's experienced, and our leaders don't make it to the presidency by studying foreign policy. Actually, Biden is probably the most experienced foreign policy leader we've had recently, and since George Bush the Elder, I believe. And so that also factors into the way US approaches foreign policy. And everybody thinks that the previous guy messed up. That's usually part of the democratic political process, is to criticize how somebody else handled the problem, and you're going to do a lot better. So that also kind of defines the US response. So broadly speaking, and here's to the patterns, US responses to Russia and to Putin's assault on the West by covert means, or sub-rosa means, or sub-military means, or hybrid warfare, has been, on the one hand, a need to engage with Russia, because Russia is a very large country with nuclear weapons, with energy resources that are very valuable to Europe in particular. I want to just pause here and say that Europe is really the main theater of this warfare, right? Because what is really at stake here is about US influence in Europe versus Russian influence in Europe. And Russia wants more influence in Europe. US has a lot of influence in Europe. And yet Russia is a very important country for Europe because it's right there. It's a neighbor, it's very heavily armed, and it has huge energy resources on which Europe depends. Of course, there are other theaters such as the Middle East. And And then that need to engage with Russia that we always feel and will always feel has to be balanced by a need to confront Russia over some of its very obvious, at least, attacks on the West, on the liberal international order. So that would include invasion of neighboring countries. Obviously, when it became known that Russia had invaded Ukraine, that got a pretty stiff response from the West. But also Russia's support for dictatorships in various places. We see that with the Taliban, for instance, right now. The destabilization of US politics, Biden administration felt compelled to respond to that, or cyber attacks. So by and large in Washington, the sort of, I think the consensus view has been, we're not really friends with Russia, and we're not really straight out enemies really with Russia either, although I think that there's various terms of art that are used, like it's a strategic competitor or something like that. But essentially we have some things in common with Russia, like we both want to, oppose terrorism. We have common interests, like we both actually want Russia to sell its energy to Europe at a reasonable price. And we have reasons we want to engage with Russia, because neither of us really wants a nuclear war, and we don't really want an all-out warfare to occur. But there's also reasons why we can't be best buddies with Russia, right? Because they have very different interests. They're trying ultimately to undermine our international system that we built at great cost and benefit from. And so you have to balance somehow these two different features. And the story of US presidents, I think, is essentially balancing. Now, it's keep in mind that US-Russia relationship began to deteriorate partway through the Putin presidency, more around 2005, 2006, and really turned anti-Western. I would date it from about 2006, 2007. So I'm not going to talk as much about Clinton policy, because Clinton was only in office for about a year, and when Putin was there, he mostly sort of hoped that expressed the hope that Putin would continue the economic reforms and democratization of Boris Yeltsin. Of course, Putin in many ways was the anti-Yeltsin, and he wasn't going to do that, but he didn't really let on too much, I don't think, to Clinton about that. When George W. Bush took office in 2001, he initially had very strongly positive views about Putin and was very friendly or thought that there could be a basis of strong friendship with Russia. There's a famous quote where after a summit meeting, he said he looked into Putin's eyes and he saw Putin's soul, or he thought he saw Putin's soul, and he deemed him to be very trustworthy. However, by the end of his administration, the United States had the worst ever relationship with Russia in its history, primarily because of missile defense, that Bush was very serious about building a kind of missile defense against Iranian missiles. He was very concerned about that, and that angered Russia. Although Russia was invited to be part of it, it nonetheless viewed that as a change in the balance of nuclear mutually assured destruction between the two countries, and therefore unacceptable. And that led to the worst ever relationship with Russia that had occurred to that point. And when Obama came in 2008, right after the Russo-Georgian War, which actually happened during the election campaign, he announced the removal of this missile defense units, although he then replaced them with something else. And he reset relationships, or tried to reset relationships with Russia, said, look, we want to get past all this difficult stuff. Let's talk about areas of cooperation. It had a huge negotiation process that took place over a long time, and basically ignored what had happened in Georgia, ignored the missile defense issue to some extent. But of course, eventually that turned sour, particularly when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. And at that point, the Obama administration imposed very damaging sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions, which had been a key tool of US influence. To go quickly and of course, Obama was also criticized, I think rightly to some extent, by Republicans for not doing enough to counter Russian influence in the 2016 election. When Trump won that election, Trump had a very, very curious relationship with President Putin. that I wish I understood fully, but I think was to some extent kind of corrupt. I think, there were definitely, Trump was looking into building a tower in Moscow. There was this all throughout the Trump presidency, he had a curious habit, which he never criticized Putin. He was much more quick to criticize the US intelligence community and to criticize the United States, saying that we're not so great either, than he was to criticize Putin. At the same time, however, you see that that the Trump administration also imposed additional sanctions on Russia during the time, and in fact had a very hard line on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a new pipeline that links directly Russia and Germany under the Black Sea, to pump Russian gas and avoid East European countries, particularly Ukraine, which Russia deems to be difficult and may want to invade. And so I think that what you see in this pattern of relationships, and I think I may have to kind of end here very quickly because of time, or in a couple minutes, is that all of our recent presidents have, on the one hand, tried to accommodate in various ways with Russia and tried to do business with Russia. And on the other hand, have ended their administrations usually with horrible, very, very poor relationship with Russia. And I suspect that pattern is also, Biden has been a little different in that he didn't come in quite as accommodating, although he has made accommodating moves. He unblocked the Nord Stream 2 pipeline construction, but he threatens cyber attacks. And so there's this curious, basically a balancing act that is impossible to manage for all of these presidents of, on the one hand, trying to confront Russia, and on the other hand, trying to accommodate Russian influence in the world stage. And so I'll just wrap up by saying that US presidents have tended to oscillate between opposition and engagement. Russia is acting aggressively, in large part because the Putin regime feels existentially threatened. It feels backed into a corner by US military approaches, by the economic approaches of the European Union, by our democracy promotion. And frankly, it's just difficult to manage a country that wants to destroy your international system. And each administration, I think, has been split between hardliners and those who seek accommodation to deal with a sort of very difficult to manage, or really unmanageable or insoluble type of problem, which is that Russia has decided that it's an anti-system country. It's against the current world system. So I think I'll just stop right there because I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. There's many, many points that can be elaborated, and I really look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mitchell. This is a tremendous amount to unpack from your opening comments, and we appreciate how you gave a multifaceted view, saying some people view it this way, some people view it that way. That's exactly what we try and do here at the Council, so we can learn from a variety of perspectives, and I know we'll have a robust conversation with you today. I can see that our audience is eager to ask questions. We've got quite a few already coming in. And for anybody in the audience, please use your Q&A feature on Zoom to submit questions in writing, and I'll facilitate those to Mitchell, our guest today. But as is customary at the Council, we give the floor first to a student, a young person who's passionate about world affairs and this topic and wants to ask a question to Mitchell. Today we have Lisa Green, who is a student at Lafayette College with us, and she's passionate about international affairs. Lisa, are you ready to ask your question to Professor Orenstein?
I am. Thank you so much. Hi, Professor Orenstein. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer my question. I'm really curious in discussing the patterns of US presidents under Putin's regime. It seems that, of course, there are many things they have in common, but in terms of specific policies, what would you say has been the most successful US administration in terms of peaceful relations with Russia, and what can President Biden take from that and implement?
So I guess I would answer that no one has been successful. None of these presidents have been successful. And the way it's looking now, I don't anticipate Biden administration also to be successful. And the reason is because of these structural, deeper issues in the relationship, right? So just think about it. Let's say, I don't know how to put it, but just say Russia wants to destroy, in my view, Russia wants to destroy the Western international system. Russia would be happy if NATO didn't exist. Russia would be happy if the EU didn't exist. Russia would be happy if the US was not a democracy, right? And not only is it sort of passively sitting by and trying to, wishing us bad, but it's actively trying to undermine all of these things, right? So then, ask yourself, so how are we going to have a good relationship with Russia, right? And if the standard is, well, what president is able to create a good relationship with Russia? It's like, good luck. I mean, there's no way. I look at this more and more. I like to find metaphors that are a little more like personal or sort of, but I think the best metaphor for this, it's like the difficult uncle problem or the bad family member problem, right? Like, let's say you have, in most families, like there's somebody who's really incredibly annoying, right? At family gatherings, for instance, right? They're going to come and they're going to just blow it up somehow, right? They're going to start talking about politics, or they're going to start, just angering somebody or picking in some sort of deep wound in the family, right? And, you face a problem then. Well, should I invite this person to the family gathering? Because if I do, I know it's going to be extremely uncomfortable and unpleasant for everybody. But if I don't, it's probably also going to be extremely unpleasant, because then they're going to call up somebody else and, get your mom not to come or something like that, because I won't come until so-and-so comes, So, the question I would pose is, so how do you deal with that? Well, the answer is you don't. It's like we're stuck together in a globe with Vladimir Putin and Russia, right? And it's just not going to be good. And I think also that goes to a kind of deeper issue in US foreign policy. The US foreign policy, we're very, very geared in this country to solve problems. Like, we're amazing at solving problems. And frankly, that's one of the best things about the United States, that we like to solve problems. But the problem in international affairs is there's a lot of problems you can't solve, right? They're just insoluble problems. They're problems that need to be managed, not solved. And if I were to pose it a different way, who has managed the situation best? I don't know. I mean, it goes to your preferences, right? Because you could manage it in a way that you protect democracy more. And we could kind of, like cyber attack Russia anytime it involves our democracy, and that would risk a little bit of warfare, but it might protect our democracy a little bit better. That's reasonable if you like democracy more than you dislike military conflict, right? You could manage it in a way that you give up on Ukraine, and risk other things happening, to avoid war today, or vice versa. So I guess my point is that they're all managing it. And they're all managing it in different ways and different flavors. And I can't be too critical, honestly, of how I find it hard to be too critical of somebody managing a problem that is like impossible to actually solve, right? You can, the only way you can criticize it is that there's some trade-offs in the way you manage it, and some people may have more trade-offs that you like, and other people more trade-offs that you dislike, but none of them are doing a great job, because there's no way to deal with it, actually.
Very good. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Mitchell. We've got quite a few questions coming in from our audience. We'll start with one from Gerald Levin. He asks, is the US now conducting or planning to conduct an offensive cyber war against Russia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I wish I knew 100%. I would say yes. So first of all, just in a planning perspective, use the word planning. There's a lot of planning. I believe there's a lot of planning. And so the US certainly has planned for cyber warfare against Russia, and has also to some extent conducted cyber attacks on Russia. There was one well-known incident that we know about. I by the way, rely on open source intelligence. I'm not privy to any, sort of top secret information. But the people I chat to, and things that I read, I mean, we know that the U.S. attacked the Internet Research Agency in Russia during the 2016 election to try to stop them, or 2020 election, try and stop them from getting directly involved. So, and there have been hacking of top members in Putin's circle. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have done it. Biden specifically threatened that he was going to do something less than a couple months ago, I believe. I never heard, what he actually did. I don't think we were necessarily supposed to hear. So yeah, I think the question is really one of degree. It's like, how far are people willing to go? And I'll just say that on the one side, people think that we should unfold more cyber attacks, which I think is a reasonable, approach, given that it's very upsetting that they're attacking us better than we attack them. On the other hand, I don't personally believe that cyber warfare is the area where we have a greatest comparative advantage. In our relationship with Russia, Russia has big cyber capacities. The US has big cyber capacities. There's at least parity in the cyber capacities. The area where the US has been more active, in my view, has been in economic sanctions. And the reason for that is because the US is the biggest economy in the world. We're allied with the European Union, which is the second biggest economy of the world, and also Russia's main trading partner and customer for its gas. And therefore, when we act in tandem with the European Union, Russia does not have an answer to that. It simply cannot impose counter sanctions that's going to hurt us. You can say we're not selling you their gas. Well, then, that hurts them more than us, because we can buy gas from Norway. They can't sell their gas because they only have pipelines primarily to the west. So in my view, that's been the primary means that the United States has looked to, as well as to the European Union, to counter Russia, is we look for the playing fields, the battlefields, you could say, where they don't ever win. And so that's why I tend to be more, if I were, in these councils, I would tend to be more on the economic sanction side of things and less on the cyber attack kind of things, although I'm sure it's pretty satisfying for people to tap their keyboards and blast something in Russia,
And as you said, we'll probably never know, especially if our attacks are successful, our counterattacks. Speaking of the geopolitical framework and economic relations, we have a question from Ed Trevisani about China and how this all ties together. Ed asks us, how would you characterize the US relationship with Russia versus the US relationship with China? Which one is more important for US interests?
Yeah, so, in US foreign policy, one of the quirks, I think, one of the problems really of US foreign policy is that we tend to, because in a way, I feel not having anything to do with World Affairs Council, by the way, but despite World Affairs Council, this country tends to be highly unsophisticated about international affairs. At least our voters overall tend to be highly unsophisticated about international affairs. Even our congressmen actually tend to be highly unsophisticated. Again, accepting several great members in Pennsylvania delegation, in particular, Congressman Boyle, I believe, who's like hyper sophisticated, I'm sure has attended your events. But by and large, we tend to be pretty unsophisticated. And one of the effects of that is that a lot of people like to think about, like, what is our one biggest challenge? Let's focus on that, right? Not, and just like leave aside that there's like 200 countries in the world. These are a big mess. And then a second problem we have is that we tend to have a sort of spotlight effect, and you can see that really happening very strongly right now. Like 3 weeks ago, nobody knew anything that was going on in Afghanistan, right? Mm-hmm. Now everybody's like super worried about what's going on in Afghanistan, and like to the point where Congress has to act, the president has to go on TV and talk about it, and so those two things, I think, really harm U.S. relationships with the rest of the world, because we can't focus on like 200 things at once. Honestly, this country can't even focus on 3 problems at once, And so I just like to premise it by saying that. Now, of course, China is the most important competitor to the United States. I don't think there's any question about that. It's also, by the way, a country to which we have much greater trade ties. So we're much more tied in with China than we are with Russia. Part of the reason we can sanction Russia is we really don't have much of an economic relationship with them. Right. So, it's a big partner for the United States, China is, and it's also a big competitor for the United States. And I don't think I would disagree with you that China is like by far, the number one issue. However, if you were to rate issues in the world, I would say Russia is probably the number two issue, in US security. And that's the way it's treated in most of the documents I look at about US foreign policy, is like, that's our other strategic competitor. And that's because of its nuclear weapons and because of its positioning right next to a lot of our allies in Europe. How do they tie together? Well, some people have argued that the United States should have a better relationship with Russia and sort of keep Russia on side to sort of face the challenge of China, right? I think that boat has sailed, a long time ago. I think Russia's has teamed up with China because it feels that it's an authoritarian dictatorship. It doesn't want to have, the pressure to be part of a liberal Western world. Putin made that choice. I think that was really the choice he made in 2006, 2007. And now they're the sort of forward, kind of like most annoying partner in that relationship for us. But again, US foreign policy really needs to balance a lot of different things, right? Actually, our biggest allies are actually Europe. Our most important relationship in the world is Europe. And you never hear people saying, well, what about Europe? How do we deal with Europe? So I just think that one of the things that I think World Affairs Councils and others, who are active in this space do is try to get people, try to get all of us to look at the world in its complexity and the various sorts of things going around. And the strategies, the mega strategies of the US has been to support democracies around the world, because that's been an effective approach, to support economies that are sort of compatible with the United States, and to build trading links and support international organizations and order that bring these things together so that we avoid conflicts, and to a large extent to tie countries like China and Russia into those relationships, which we also do. And so I think that more complex, multifaceted, approach is better. And then, what that implies is you need to have a lot of experts in everywhere. And universities used to do that more than they do, but largely we are in that business where we train people in dozens of languages, and there could be more of that. There could be more of that, and so that we have people all the time who are always interested in these things. And I could go into a whole discursus about the deprofessionalization of the State Department, right? The State Department's under attack exactly because some people don't want to do that, don't think that's important. So anyway, this is a great question.
I think you've got some like-minded folks in our audience who, of course, believe in the impact and importance of world affairs, even on a hyper-local level, although it's not as immediate. And I appreciate you sharing your time and perspective with us today. We've taught 1 million students so far in our past 70 years, and we're working on the next 1 million right now, and working with adults on programming like this. And you mentioned Afghanistan, which of course is completely consumed the news, even over the pandemic for the past few days. And we've got 2 questions which are tied together on Afghanistan and Russia. Gilda asks us, what is the relationship with Afghanistan and Russia, and what will happen to it after Afghanistan falls? And Julie Shaw follows up specifically, what is Putin's stance on the Taliban? What can we expect from him? And has he said anything, made comments about the US's departure from Afghanistan? Comments on Afghanistan, Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, I am not 100% sure if he's made comments in the past couple of days about Afghanistan, but I think not. So let me just explain a little bit more about how Russia pursues relationships, right? So the United States, we pursue relationships of friendship and cooperation and mutual benefit, right? And that's what our relationship with the European Union is about. We want the European Union to grow, to develop, to become extremely strong, and in some respects to challenge us economically, as a bloc. That's welcome because we share a set of values with them and a deep relationship, which is based on democratization. It's based on trade ties. It's based on a common culture of various sorts, and our vision of world affairs in ways that we want everybody to share this vision. We're so happy with it, and Unfortunately, not everybody shares that, but we're going to keep trying, and that's really been since Reagan, kind of re-emphasized that in a way. Carter, in his own way, that community of democracies, which you see also Biden talking about. Russia's approach is really, really different, and I think it's hard to understand for a lot of Americans, which is that it doesn't actually have any friends. Russia really doesn't have any allies. It is not really allied with China. I would say it's a competitor, but with a close-ish relationship with China. Actually, China is the country that Russia is also most threatened by in the world.
Right.
And by the way, they're much more threatened by China than we are in a lot of ways, because they share a long border with China and they're depopulating on their side. And, so Russia's view about other countries is not that they want to be best friends. So if I would not say that Putin is best friends with the Taliban or that he aspires to be best friends with the Taliban. What Russia wants is they want to have a voice at the table, a seat at the table, and to be a partner in a way for all these countries, particularly in the Middle East and Europe. They want to be considered a great power. And what a great power is like the United States, they want to have a voice in those settings. And so, we can get worried about, okay, Putin has a great relationship with the Taliban, but I can guarantee you he also has a great relationship with people who hate the Taliban, right? So they have a growing relationship with Iran. They have a growing relationship with Israel. Like, let that sink in for a second, right? How do they have a great relationship with Iran and with Israel at the same time? I suspect that the way they do this is it's not that they really are valuing the relationship so much, but what they're valuing is that they have a seat at the table. And that, for instance, if a conflict emerges between Iran and Israel, they can be the ones to say, cool it on this, cool it on that. The real red line for these people is X, and don't cross it, and vice versa, right? They want to be like a broker, a trusted broker in a certain sense, or have influence, an influence maker. I see this also in their energy relationships, right? One of the puzzles about Russia is that they're the huge oil exporter and gas exporter, but their closest relationships are with other countries that are also oil and gas exporters, who are basically their competitors. So how does that work exactly, right? And so it's not really based on confluence of interest. It's based on they want to throw their weight around. They want to be involved. So I think, and then the other point to make about Afghanistan is that Russia also invaded Afghanistan and is also seen in the Middle East as a colonial power that has, since the 1850s, conquered, and probably before, conquered a lot of Muslim countries on its borders, including Afghanistan. And so I don't think they're very liked in Afghanistan, honestly. But if they're content with the US leaving Afghanistan, they're willing to support the government, provide support for the government, diplomatic and whatever other type of financial military support, to sort of stand up a government with some sort of conditions that they're not going to make clear to anybody. But, you can kind of see taking shape. The Taliban regime, it looks like, that's taking shape is going to be pretty different from the Taliban regime that existed before. And that's the result, most likely, in my view, of some sort of behind the scenes diplomacy of major powers telling them, look, if you want to do this, do it in a way that you're not rocking the boat too much, that, people feel the need to come and invade you. So they'll be the kind of partner at the table who, on the one hand, are helping out, and on the one hand, are sort of setting some sort of limits, perhaps.
All eyes are watching, right? Until something else happens, perhaps. But we're all watching Afghanistan and keenly curious to see what the Taliban will do, as you said, and how these partners will overtly or covertly try and affect the next steps. We have a question from Janice that takes a step back on the broad perspective again. And Janice asks us, given Russia's size, can she really be a global threat to dismantle international structures and alliances? Or is she more of, say, a nuisance with a continual cat and mouse game? Does Russia really believe that she can regain her world position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that gets to my answer before of, like, I think this perspective and that question really demonstrates one of the points that I made initially, which is that Westerners are very, very slow, have been very, very slow to really believe that Russia is really trying to do what it wants to do. And you're not alone in this. I think many, many top experts and leading governmental figures have also been kind of slow to say, so is Russia really serious about this, and can they really achieve it? I mean, is that something that's serious? I mean, so, and people still don't believe it. I mean, I think a lot of people still don't believe it. But you look at the 2016 election, they intervened heavily for one candidate and they got what they wanted. Now, they may not have gotten it the second time around, so you could say, well, maybe they don't really matter that much, but, I think they matter a lot. I think they've turned the tables, contributed to turning tables in Afghanistan. You look at Turkey, the situation with, the Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, turned the tables on the United States. I mean, nuclear weapons, I mean, this sort of hypersonic weaponry. I mean, when that first came out, people were like, what in the world is hypersonic, nuclear weapons? What it means is like, a submarine, off the coast of Houston can like blow up, your mom's house in like 30 seconds, that's what it means. And so, they're not the strongest player. And here's the part where I think that more dovish perspective is kind of right, is saying, well, yeah, of course you got to step back and say, okay, the United States is way stronger than Russia, and like, what can they really do to us? There's a point there, but the point I would make is they can do a lot of things, and they can do everything if we let them, right? If you're a sleeping giant, you can get, turned over,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, I don't think we should underestimate. I think that's another piece about, going back to like how we look at world affairs. We can only look at the most important threat at a time, but, we can be turned over for sure. And I look at the attack on sort of, the spread of extremism, for instance. That's another way Russia has really tried to attack a lot of Central European and Western powers, is to fund extremist organizations, for instance, hate groups in the South and various like Facebook groups, that spread hate, by the way, both on the Black Lives Matter and on the anti-Black Lives Matter side of things, which is an old kind of Soviet technique. And, they've been really successful, I would say. I mean, I think that without them, a lot of things, wouldn't have happened the same way. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, look, you don't want to go into international affairs, combat in a way, underestimating your enemy, basically.
Always a good lesson to follow. We have a question about succession and Putin. And recently we had a program about China as well, where we discussed that because President Xi has basically taken leadership for life, does that destabilize China when Xi's presidency ends? May it be spontaneous through illness, or something that we can see coming for a long time, but perhaps no one dares to acknowledge? Are we looking at a similar situation with Putin? If he's in charge sort of indefinitely, is there perhaps a secret succession plan? And if either way, what might happen when Putin steps down, and how will that destabilize or create opportunity for all the players we've talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, both in China and in Russia. I think that Putin does represent a kind of return to a model of president for life, like authoritarian dictatorship. One of my friends, by the way, wrote a book about electoral democracies, or not sort of countries or that are basically democracies, but they don't really change power, sort of semi-authoritarian regimes, that kind of thing. But I mean, this is a full-on authoritarian regime, right? And I think that that's been what China apparently has learned from Putin. And I agree that the key issue with those regimes is instability, is the end game. What's the end game? Like, who do you turn it over to? In a way, Russia has become more centralized. Power has become more centralized under Putin in the past 10 years than even I thought. So I was talking with a dovish friend of mine a couple of days ago who was saying, yeah, I think Putin now at this point is pretty much running Russia. And I pointed out, I thought that, of course, 10 years ago, right? But the point is that that the dovish perspective is not entirely wrong. There were factions in the Kremlin, and there were factions that could have challenged Russia. But from the point of view of even more dovish analysts, they would argue that that's passed away. And so, and I hear similar things. I'm not a China expert. I hear similar things in China that, he really has things under control there. Is willing to wipe out, any opponents, et cetera. So those regimes, it's like Mubarak in Egypt, they're going to end badly, and the question of succession is a really important one. And that is a flaw. I mean, that is a flaw in those regimes. And the way that Putin gained power was the previous president basically handed it over to him. Yeltsin said, I'm appointing this guy interim president. You're going to love him. You should vote for him in May. And that's pretty much what happened. So I think that whole question of succession, it's not one you really want to raise when you're a dictator for life, right? Because then the question is like, well, what happens to me? And as soon as you indicate weakness, then people are saying, well, if he's going to be gone in a year or two, like, why can't we just get rid of him now? And so yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. I share those views, definitely. I think that's one of the benefits of democracy is you get rid of your leaders periodically, and nobody can really be in charge forever. You have a chance to make some changes and change course a little bit. It has its weaknesses too, but I'd be far in for democracy for those reasons. And yeah, I mean, most people in the opposition in Russia also think that if the Putin regime ends, it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be a big mess. And that's also historically how things have ended, both in China and in Russia. China has those, periods of, stability, and then periods of like total chaos. And Russia has, similar kind of history of times of troubles. And yeah, it's an enduring problem. And this goes to another issue, I think, that hasn't really been raised, but sort of, is Putin really a great strategist? Or is he really just like a standard variety dictator? In other words, he's just trying to create big problems for us, but he doesn't really have his own agenda. Like, what would be a Putin world? Would that be a great place to live, really? Or is that an attractive model? I mean, for most East European countries, it has not been an attractive model. For most East European countries, they want to get away from that, right? Because they see exactly how Russia actually operates internally, and they don't really want to be a part of it. They'd rather be a part of the European Union, including Ukraine. I mean, you could argue that Russia has really chased Ukraine out of its sphere of influence by its malfeasance, right? So there's a bigger question of like, are these people really genius, amazing leaders who are the richest people in the world, and we should look up to them and we think they're, or are they tin pot dictators who don't know what the world they're doing and are basically just setting themselves up and their countries up for kind of fall somewhere down the line?
Whether it's an art or a science or an accident, Putin has certainly left us guessing on that question and what comes after him. Mitchell, thank you so much for your expertise and wisdom and multifaceted perspective. You gave us a lot of different opinions and different ways to examine the complex Russia relationship and issues around the world, which is just what our audience is hungry for, to become more informed about world affairs from a civil and complex viewpoint. There is so much happening in the world right now, and it's important to refocus on this perhaps not most important relationship, right? We can't rank them, but certainly in the top 2 or 3 that we know our government is focusing on. And for all of our audience members today, we encourage you to join us for the other council's upcoming events for the fall, and our starting lineup will be announced tomorrow, actually. On September 20th, we'll be looking at the global and domestic impacts of the pharmaceutical supply chain issues with both in-person and live stream components. And on September 27th, we'll be hosting a webinar panel discussion about the global movement for Black lives with perspectives from around the world. On October 27th, we'll be hosting Bunsey Ellis Churchill. Her name may ring familiar to some of you. She's President Emerita of the Council, and she'll lead a discussion about the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. And then on November 4th, we'll be hosting an off-the-record intimate conversation with Ambassador Kanji Yamanouchi, the Consul General of Japan in New York, and a very high-level Japanese diplomat. You'll be able to learn about these events on our website, www.wacphila.org. and through our email communications. So please do stay tuned. There's a virtual round of applause, I'm sure, going around for you right now, Mitchell. Thank you for your time and expertise today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to appear before your group.
Indeed. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.